completely and utterly obliterate the visually intoxicating, highly choreographed cinematic hallucination of the glorious, romanticized pirate naval battle, the deeply entrenched Hollywood set piece where charismatic, impeccably dressed swashbucklers casually swing from pristine hemp ropes, gracefully landing on the deck of a Spanish galleon to engage in polite, synchronized swordplay. The modern entertainment complex absolutely demands that you visualize an 18th century broadside as a clean, theatrical exchange of fire where neat, round holes are punched through wooden sails and the rugged heroes miraculously emerge completely unscathed to claim their golden treasure. When you aggressively strip away the soaring orchestral soundtracks, the stunt coordinators, and the heavy studio lighting, the unvarnished, aerodynamic, and biomechanical reality of Golden Age maritime combat reveals a terrifying, claustrophobic nightmare of instantaneous blunt force trauma, catastrophic acoustic shockwaves, and a mathematically guaranteed biological meat grinder completely devoid of any cinematic glory. To fundamentally understand the absolute physical nightmare of a naval engagement, you must first aggressively dismantle the Hollywood illusion of the pristine, open-air gun deck. The silver screen relentlessly portrays these areas as spacious, well-lit environments where men politely load cannons while delivering witty dialogue. The unyielding architectural truth is that the gun deck of an 18th century warship or heavily armed pirate sloop was a microscopic, unventilated, suffocating wooden tunnel mathematically designed strictly for localized industrial slaughter. The ceiling clearance was frequently less than 5 feet, forcing grown, heavily malnourished men to operate completely hunched over in the suffocating darkness. When a localized battery of massive, 2-ton cast-iron cannons was simultaneously detonated, the resulting release of thermodynamic and kinetic energy was mathematically apocalyptic. The explosion instantly consumed all available oxygen in the claustrophobic space, immediately filling the deck with a blinding, highly corrosive, and suffocating cloud of thick white sulfur and black powder smoke that mathematically burned the respiratory tract and completely blinded the gun crews. Simultaneously, the acoustic reality of firing 30 heavy cannons inside a completely enclosed wooden box generated an instantaneous, deafening kinetic shockwave that routinely exceeded 140 decibels. This aggressive acoustic trauma did not result in a temporary cinematic ringing of the ears. It violently, mathematically ruptured the delicate tympanic membranes of the crew, aggressively tearing the eardrums and causing them to actively hemorrhage dark red blood down the sides of their necks, leaving the men completely, permanently deafened and relying entirely on localized, frantic hand signals in the pitch-black, suffocating fog of war. But the absolute, undisputed apex terror of the naval broadside was not the deafening noise or the chemical smoke. It was the completely misunderstood, unyielding kinetic physics of the cannonball itself. The directors relentlessly condition you to believe that a 12-pound, solid cast-iron sphere moving at subsonic velocities simply punches a clean, harmless hole directly through the side of a wooden ship. The unvarnished, metallurgical, and kinetic truth is one of catastrophic structural displacement. When that massive, heavy iron sphere impacted the dense, 3-foot-thick seasoned English oak of the ship's hull, the kinetic energy did not simply pass through. The massive iron ball acted as a localized, supersonic sledgehammer, violently transferring 100% of its kinetic payload directly into the rigid cellular structure of the heavy timber. This horrific thermodynamic transfer instantly transformed the unyielding oak hull into a devastating, localized bomb. The inner wall of the ship aggressively exploded inward, instantly generating a blinding, supersonic cloud of massive, jagged wooden shrapnel. These were absolutely not the tiny, harmless splinters depicted on the silver screen. They were heavy, 3 foot long, violently twisting wooden javelins traveling at velocities capable of physically severing a mainmast. When this apocalyptic wall of jagged oak tore through the densely packed, claustrophobic gun deck, it executed a mathematically guaranteed biological slaughter. The massive wooden shards aggressively shredded human cellular tissue, violently amputated localized limbs without warning, and possessed the absolute mechanical leverage to physically pin screaming, fully enervated men directly to the heavy wooden deck beams behind them. A single, well-placed iron round shot did not kill by direct impact. It mathematically weaponized the ship's own architecture, biologically pulverizing the crew in a horrifying, blood-soaked display of absolute mechanical butchery that left the deck completely slick with shattered bone, torn muscle, and massive arterial hemorrhaging. Furthermore, we must completely and permanently eradicate the most deeply worshipped, physically absurd maritime stunt in Hollywood history: the heroic, perfectly timed boarding swing. The cinematic sequence where the charismatic captain grabs a loose halyard, launches himself from the rigging, and gracefully arcs across 50 feet of open air to land flawlessly on the enemy quarterdeck, sword drawn and ready to fight. The unvarnished, unyielding aerodynamic and gravitational reality of the open ocean completely shatters this suicidal delusion. You are not swinging between two stationary studio platforms. You are mathematically attempting to execute a flawless pendulum arc between two massive 300-ton wooden leviathans that are completely at the mercy of a violent, completely unpredictable oceanic swell. The ships are aggressively pitching, rolling, and violently heaving in completely opposite localized directions on the heavy waves, attempting to generate the exact necessary aerodynamic velocity to cross the yawning, chaotic chasm between the two hulls is an act of absolute biological insanity. If a pirate mathematically misjudged the swing by a fraction of a second, or if the enemy ship violently rolled away on a wave just as he reached the apex of his arc, he did not heroically land on the deck. A localized loss of kinetic momentum mathematically guaranteed dropping the desperate man directly into the terrifying, crushing, absolute mechanical meat grinder of the open ocean between the two massive wooden hulls. As the heavy ships violently crashed together in the unforgiving swell, the hundreds of tons of solid oak would instantly, aggressively catch the falling man, biologically pulverizing his human skeletal structure into an unrecognizable, blood-soaked paste before his crushed remains were violently sucked down into the freezing, crushing depths of the oceanic undertow. And for the desperate men whose bodies were violently shattered by the wooden shrapnel, but somehow mathematically survived the initial kinetic trauma of the gun deck, the true, agonizing biological nightmare was only just beginning. The cinematic illusion of maritime survival completely omits the terrifying, unvarnished reality of the ship's surgeon. If a man required catastrophic, localized medical intervention, he was aggressively dragged completely down into the pitch black, suffocating, completely unventilated bowels of the ship, the surgeon's cockpit, located deep below the waterline. Operating entirely by the dim, flickering, unstable light of a single whale oil lantern on a wooden deck completely saturated with human blood, vomit, and highly corrosive seawater, the ship's surgeon prepared to execute the unyielding mathematical protocol of the sea: immediate, completely unsterilized amputation. There was absolutely no cinematic anesthesia available to numb the central nervous system. The surgeon would produce a heavy, rusted iron bone saw, frequently heavily caked in the dried biological matter and congealed cellular tissue of the previous 8 crewmen he had just operated on. The conscious, fully aware victim was physically, aggressively held down by his terrified, deafened crewmates on a blood-soaked wooden table, while the surgeon violently hacked through the living, fully enervated bone, the thick muscle tissue, and the massive nerve clusters. And this barbaric, excruciating procedure was mathematically executed while the entire ship was actively taking heavy incoming fire, violently shuddering from localized cannon impacts and aggressively pitching 20 degrees back and forth in the chaotic ocean swell, completely destroying any possibility of surgical precision. The agonizing, localized neurological trauma of this unsterilized butchery frequently caused the victim's central nervous system to completely and violently crash, dropping them into fatal, irreversible physiological shock and mathematically killing them from pure, unadulterated biomechanical pain before the massive wound could even be closed. But if they possessed the terrifying biological fortitude to survive the rusted iron saw, they were instantly plunged into an absolutely unwinnable microbiological war. The localized, suffocating environment of an 18th century wooden hull was a damp, rotting, completely contaminated ecosystem heavily infested with massive black rats, stagnant bilge water, and microscopic bacteria. The hastily sutured, completely unwashed stump was mathematically guaranteed to immediately develop aggressive, catastrophic gangrene. Without a single drop of modern antibiotics or any fundamental understanding of germ theory, the victim's cellular tissue would violently rot from the inside out. The massive, localized bacterial infection would aggressively flood the bloodstream, triggering a relentless, boiling fever of violent septic delirium. The completely doomed pirate would slowly, agonizingly perish in the dark, suffocating hold, their internal organs systematically shutting down in a terrifying, slow-motion biological apocalypse thousands of miles away from any localized landmass. This is the rusted, blood-soaked, and mathematically unyielding mechanical reality of the Golden Age of Piracy that the algorithm desperately tries to sanitize. It is a history completely devoid of romantic rope swings, clean cannon shots, and honorable duels, forged entirely in the panicked, deafening, and violently claustrophobic shadows of the gun deck, where the absolute deadliest weapon was the catastrophic physics of the wooden ship itself. Completely and unequivocally obliterate the deeply comforting, almost comedic cinematic hallucination of the legendary pirate execution, the heavily sanitized Hollywood set piece where a defiant, charismatic captive is politely blindfolded, their hands neatly bound, and they are theatrically forced to walk off a perfectly straight wooden plank into the pristine, crystal-clear Caribbean waters below. The modern entertainment complex absolutely demands that you accept this highly theatrical, completely fabricated nautical myth, relentlessly conditioning you to view pirate discipline as a formalized, almost honorable ritual. When you aggressively strip away the orchestral swells, the fictionalized adventure novels, and the sterile studio lighting, the unvarnished, historical, and biomechanical reality of Golden Age maritime punishment reveals a terrifying, completely unregulated ecosystem of absolute physical torture and mathematically guaranteed biological apocalypse. The hardened, sociopathic men who commanded these heavily armed maritime syndicates did not waste valuable, perfectly seasoned ship's lumber to construct a theatrical diving board. They relied on absolute, unyielding mechanical leverage and the horrifying, localized biological apex predators of the open ocean. When a captured captain refused to surrender his navigational charts, or a mutinous crew member violated the ship's ironclad articles, they were not politely asked to take a cinematic swim. They were forcefully subjected to the most terrifying, completely misunderstood mechanical nightmare in the history of naval warfare: keel hauling. The directors completely sanitize or entirely omit this horrific, unvarnished practice because the biomechanical reality is too gruesome for the silver screen. The victim was violently stripped completely naked, and heavily abrasive, salt-hardened hemp ropes were aggressively bound to their wrists and ankles. These ropes were routed completely underneath the massive, unyielding U-shaped belly of the wooden ship. The victim was then violently thrown overboard, and the entire crew utilized the absolute, uncompromising mechanical advantage of the ship's heavy iron winch system to aggressively drag the screaming man completely beneath the vessel, from one side to the other. The silver screen ignores the terrifying, unyielding marine biology attached to an 18th century hull. The bottom of the ship was not smooth, polished cinematic wood. It was heavily and completely encrusted with millions of massive, razor-sharp, highly calcified oceanic barnacles. As the victim was mechanically, violently dragged tight against the unyielding curve of the hull, these dense calcium deposits acted as tens of thousands of localized, microscopic scalpels. The massive kinetic tension of the ropes aggressively, completely flayed the human dermal tissue directly off the victim's back, face, and chest, mathematically stripping the biological armor away and exposing the raw, highly vascularized muscle underneath to the completely contaminated, hypersalinated seawater. Simultaneously, the victim's lungs, desperately fighting the unyielding thermodynamic pressure of the ocean depth, would violently involuntarily inhale, instantly filling the delicate alveolar tissue with freezing salt water and inducing catastrophic mechanical asphyxiation. If the victim was dragged slowly enough to mathematically survive the biological drowning, they were hauled back onto the deck completely unrecognizable, a biologically shattered, heavily bleeding mass of torn cellular tissue that was instantly guaranteed to develop aggressive, localized gangrene and raging septicemia, ensuring a slow, agonizing descent into complete physiological shutdown over the following weeks. Furthermore, we must completely and permanently eradicate the most deeply worshipped, visually intoxicating economic myth of the entire pirate genre. The legendary, pristine wooden chest overflowing with glittering Spanish doubloons, heavy gold bars, and perfectly cut rubies, meticulously buried beneath a cinematic palm tree with a highly stylized, red-inked parchment map left behind for future generations. The unvarnished, macroeconomic reality of the 18th century pirate ecosystem completely shatters this childish, romanticized financial delusion. The men who operated these ruthless maritime syndicates were absolutely not forward-thinking banking executives securing long-term investments. They were desperate, heavily diseased, mathematically doomed fugitives operating with an absolute 0% probability of surviving to see their next birthday, let alone returning to a localized geographical coordinate 10 years later to retrieve a buried box. When a pirate sloop successfully engaged and captured a heavily armed merchant vessel, the cargo hold absolutely did not contain theatrical treasure chests. The economic lifeblood of the Caribbean was built entirely on heavy, deeply unglamorous, completely unromantic agricultural and industrial commodities. The pirates were mathematically forced to steal massive, incredibly heavy wooden barrels of highly volatile black powder, thousands of pounds of completely unprocessed, rotting animal hides, massive crates of iron nails, and completely unrefined, raw sugar. There was absolutely no cinematic glory in manually transferring 300 heavy barrels of salted, heavily rotting fish from a sinking galleon in the middle of a suffocating, hyper-humid tropical depression. Once this heavily depreciating, unglamorous cargo was secured, the pirates absolutely did not bury it in the sand. They immediately and aggressively sailed to localized, heavily corrupted, unregulated coastal boomtowns to rapidly, frantically liquidate these agricultural assets at a massive financial loss, trading tons of stolen lumber and rotting meat for absolute biological necessities like clean drinking water, fresh hemp rigging, and highly concentrated, completely unregulated raw rum. And this brings us to the absolute, unyielding destruction of the cinematic pirate haven, heavily portrayed by Hollywood as a raucous, charmingly mischievous tropical utopia, where charismatic outlaws drink endlessly in beautiful, candlelit taverns surrounded by laughing women and acoustic guitars. The actual historical reality of ports like Nassau in the Bahamas or the legendary Tortuga reveals a terrifying, completely unregulated, biologically catastrophic nightmare of unvarnished human misery. These settlements were absolutely not built on pristine cinematic beaches. They were hastily constructed in the absolute center of heavily stagnant, deeply suffocating, and completely contaminated mangrove swamps. They were completely devoid of any basic architectural sanitation, meaning the raw, untreated biological waste of thousands of heavily diseased, unwashed men was dumped directly into the localized water table. This created a massive, perfect thermodynamic incubator for the ultimate, completely invisible apex predator of the Caribbean, the tropical mosquito. The directors absolutely refused to film the horrific, microbiological reality of these pirate utopias. They were ground zero for catastrophic, localized, and completely unstoppable epidemics of yellow fever, cholera, and malaria. When a pirate arrived in these swamps with his meager share of stolen goods, he was not greeted by adventure. He was immediately subjected to a massive, localized bacterial and viral payload. Without a single drop of modern antibiotics, the progression of 18th-century yellow fever was an absolute, slow-motion biological apocalypse. The virus aggressively attacked the victim's internal organs, causing the liver to completely shut down, and mathematically flooding the bloodstream with toxic bilirubin, turning the skin and the whites of the eyes a horrifying, sickly yellow. As the human gastrointestinal tract violently hemorrhaged, the desperately ill men would uncontrollably vomit heavy, coagulated black blood directly onto the rotting wooden floorboards of the taverns, dying in absolute, screaming, highly contagious agony while their completely unsympathetic crewmates simply stepped over their rotting corpses to order another cup of toxic, unrefined alcohol. Finally, we must aggressively dismantle the heavily choreographed, visually stunning cinematic hallucination of the elegant, honorable pirate duel. The modern algorithm relentlessly conditions you to visualize two impeccably balanced men gracefully parrying and thrusting with lightweight, perfectly balanced fencing swords, trading witty insults while leaping effortlessly across the pristine rigging. The true, unvarnished biomechanical reality of boarding combat was an incredibly brief, suffocating, and terrifying collision of complete blunt force trauma and localized kinetic butchery. The weapon of choice was the naval cutlass, which was absolutely not an elegant, delicate foil. It was a massive, incredibly heavy, painfully unbalanced slab of cheap, rusted iron, essentially functioning as a localized meat cleaver, specifically designed to violently hack through heavy, salt-hardened rigging lines and thick human muscle with absolute, unyielding mechanical leverage. There was absolutely no cinematic defense, no graceful blocking. A true fight on a boarding deck was a panicked, completely uncoordinated brawl executed on heavily slanted wooden planks, completely and permanently coated in a highly frictionless, inescapable layer of hypersalinated ocean spray and fresh, coagulated human blood. Men would violently slip and fall into the chaotic meat grinder of flailing iron. When their heavy, smooth-bore flintlock pistols mathematically failed to detonate, because the highly humid, deeply corrosive maritime ecosystem instantly degraded and dampened the exposed black powder, the desperate pirates did not politely throw the weapon aside and draw a sword. They immediately inverted the heavy, 3-pound solid iron and brass firearm, utilizing the massive wooden handle as a brutal, unyielding kinetic sledgehammer, bringing it violently crashing down onto their opponent's skull. This catastrophic transfer of localized physical energy instantly caved in the fragile human orbital bones, mathematically guaranteeing a massive, irreversible cerebral hemorrhage. The absolute, undeniable truth of the Golden Age of Piracy was not forged by buried gold, honorable swordplay, or cinematic planks. It was a brutal, terrifying, mathematically doomed gauntlet of absolute mechanical paranoia, horrific microbiological collapse, and unyielding thermodynamic violence, where the men who sailed under the black flag were completely, biologically erased by the very ocean they mistakenly believed they had conquered. Completely and unequivocally obliterate the visually intoxicating, deeply romanticized cinematic hallucination of the iconic pirate flag. The heavily sanitized Hollywood set piece, where the Jolly Roger is triumphantly raised as a symbol of heroic, swashbuckling rebellion just before the charismatic captain enthusiastically orders his men into a glorious, symmetrical naval battle. The modern entertainment complex has spent a century relentlessly conditioning you to view these black flags as charming maritime logos, completely omitting the terrifying, unyielding psychological and macroeconomic reality of 18th century pirate warfare. The unvarnished historical truth is that a pirate syndicate absolutely, mathematically despised symmetrical combat. Engaging in a fair, highly kinetic cannon exchange with a heavily armed merchant vessel was an act of absolute financial and biological suicide. The men who operated these stolen ships possessed completely zero access to naval shipyards, dry docks, or massive reserves of seasoned replacement timber. If a single localized enemy cannonball violently shattered their mainmast or aggressively compromised the structural integrity of their hull below the waterline, the pirates were mathematically doomed to a horrifying, slow-motion death by starvation and exposure, trapped in the unyielding, completely frictionless doldrums of the open ocean. Therefore, the black flag was absolutely not a banner of adventure. It was a highly calculated, deeply aggressive instrument of localized psychological terror, specifically engineered to force an immediate, bloodless surrender without firing a single, expensive iron round. It was a completely uncompromising maritime threat. Surrender the cargo instantly, or face absolute biological erasure. And the directors absolutely refused to film the terrifying, unvarnished reality of what happened when a brave merchant captain actually decided to violently resist. The moment the first defensive cannon was fired, the pirates immediately lowered the black flag and aggressively hoisted the completely terrifying, solid red flag, historically known as the Balkans. This was the absolute, unyielding signal of no quarter. It mathematically guaranteed that the pirates would now execute a localized, completely unrestrained biological slaughter, violently executing every single human being on board the enemy vessel with absolute mechanical prejudice to send a deafening, terrifying sociological message across the entire Caribbean ecosystem that resisting their syndicate meant instantaneous, unrecorded death. Furthermore, we must aggressively dismantle the heavily choreographed, completely fabricated cinematic illusion of the dictatorial, aristocratic pirate captain, relentlessly portrayed by the silver screen as an absolute monarch who effortlessly commanded his crew through sheer, terrifying charisma and iron-fisted tyranny. The modern algorithm demands that you visualize a ship where the captain's word is unquestioned law, and mutineers are instantly, dramatically struck down in a synchronized sword fight on the quarterdeck. The unvarnished, sociological, and organizational reality of a Golden Age pirate vessel completely shatters this childish, dictatorial fantasy. These heavily armed ships were actually the most radical, hyper-democratic, and highly localized micro-republics on the face of the planet. The captain was absolutely not an unyielding king. He was a highly expendable, mathematically vulnerable military contractor who was directly, aggressively elected by the unwashed, heavily diseased crew. His absolute authority only mathematically existed during the exact, highly kinetic microseconds of active combat or a direct chase. The exact moment the cannons cooled and the adrenaline faded, the captain was immediately stripped of his dictatorial power. The true, unvarnished, unyielding control of the ship's daily operations, the precise distribution of the stolen agricultural assets, and the administration of localized physical punishment rested entirely in the hands of the quartermaster, a completely separate elected official specifically designed to aggressively counteract the captain's influence. If a pirate captain mathematically failed to secure enough stolen cargo or demonstrated a catastrophic lack of tactical aggression in combat, the crew did not engage in a cinematic, highly theatrical mutiny involving hidden daggers and midnight assassinations. They simply, bureaucratically convened a localized, heavily armed democratic assembly on the main deck, aggressively voted the captain completely out of power, stripped him of his navigational charts, and unceremoniously dumped him directly onto a completely barren, sun-baked, unyielding sandbar with nothing but a single, highly corrosive flintlock pistol and one unjacketed lead ball, leaving him to mathematically rot in the suffocating heat while the newly elected syndicate sailed away. But the absolute, undisputed apex terror of the 18th century maritime ecosystem was not the unyielding threat of mutiny or the horrific kinetic exchange of cannon fire. It was the completely sanitized, deeply misunderstood microbiological nightmare of the pirate diet. Hollywood relentlessly portrays the pirate galley as a rustic, cheerful kitchen overflowing with massive wooden bowls of fresh fruit, roasted tropical boar, and endless, pristine bottles of sweet Caribbean rum. The directors completely refused to film the horrific, unvarnished reality of attempting to preserve localized biological calories in a highly humid, deeply corrosive, and completely unventilated wooden hold for 6 consecutive months. The vast, completely uncharted expanses of the Atlantic Ocean were entirely devoid of any localized agricultural infrastructure, meaning the crew was absolutely, mathematically forced to survive on a catastrophic, deeply contaminated diet that actively triggered a complete physiological collapse. The primary, unyielding staple of this horrific nutritional gauntlet was hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit. The silver screen depicts this as a slightly stale piece of bread. The actual, historical, and biomechanical reality was a massive, incredibly dense block of heavily baked flour and salt that was mathematically, structurally harder than the unyielding oak deck of the ship itself. It was completely impossible to physically bite into without instantly, violently shattering the human teeth. To consume this absolute nutritional nightmare, the pirates were forced to aggressively soak the biscuit in boiling, hypersalinated seawater or stale alcohol. But the true, completely terrifying biological reality of the hardtack was its massive, completely unavoidable localized ecosystem of parasitic infestation. The damp, rotting, unventilated hold of the ship provided a perfect thermodynamic incubator for massive colonies of deeply aggressive, heavily reproducing weevils and maggots. When a desperate, starving pirate bit into his softened ration in the pitch-black darkness of the gun deck, he was mathematically, unavoidably, consuming thousands of live, writhing insect larvae just to hit his absolute minimum caloric baseline to prevent localized starvation. And this terrifying culinary nightmare completely extended to the ship's absolute most critical biological necessity: fresh drinking water. The modern entertainment complex ignores the unyielding microbiological reality of storing thousands of gallons of completely unpurified river water in highly porous, unsealed wooden casks. Within a matter of mere weeks in the suffocating tropical heat of the Caribbean, the localized water supply violently and aggressively turned completely toxic. The stagnant water bred massive, localized colonies of microscopic algae, aggressively mutating bacteria, and a thick, suffocating layer of green, highly viscous biological slime that coated the interior of the heavy oak barrels. The water mathematically transformed into a putrid, deeply foul-smelling, and highly infectious biological sludge that guaranteed acute, catastrophic dysentery and rampant gastrointestinal hemorrhaging. To physically force themselves to swallow this rotting, completely contaminated biological liquid without violently vomiting, the pirates relied entirely on the absolute, uncompromising chemical properties of heavily distilled, high-proof sugarcane alcohol. They did not drink rum to engage in cinematic, cheerful tavern songs. They drank it as a desperate, unvarnished biological necessity. The aggressive, highly caustic properties of the unrefined rum violently masked the horrific, putrid flavor of the rotting algae and acted as a crude, localized antibacterial agent. The ship's quartermaster would heavily mix the toxic, stagnant water with the raw rum and completely unrefined, highly acidic lime juice, creating the legendary concoction known as grog. This daily, mathematically mandatory ingestion of heavily concentrated alcohol and rotting water completely, permanently destroyed the pirates' central nervous systems, aggressively triggering a massive, localized epidemic of completely untreated chronic liver failure, violently deteriorating their fine motor skills, and mathematically guaranteeing that the men who sailed these heavily armed syndicates were completely, biologically rotting from the inside out. Finally, we must completely and permanently eradicate the deeply charming, visually iconic cinematic trope of the heroic pirate prosthetic. The algorithm relentlessly demands that you visualize a rugged, heavily scarred quartermaster cheerfully stomping around the pristine deck with a beautifully carved, highly functional wooden peg leg, or a menacing captain gracefully wielding a polished, perfectly balanced iron hook in place of his missing hand. The unvarnished, biomechanical, and orthopedic reality of an 18th century amputation completely shatters this highly theatrical, physics-defying delusion. These were absolutely not clean, highly engineered medical devices. They were crude, heavy, completely unhygienic pieces of raw debris violently strapped to heavily traumatized, fully innervated biological tissue. When a pirate mathematically survived the horrific, unsterilized butchery of the surgeon's bone saw, the resulting amputation stump absolutely never healed cleanly. Without modern antibiotics or sterile surgical environments, the raw, heavily vascularized tissue was constantly inflamed, incredibly sensitive, and aggressively prone to completely raging, localized staph infections. When a desperate man strapped a heavy, unyielding piece of raw timber directly against this completely traumatized, screaming nerve cluster, the resulting biomechanical friction was mathematically agonizing. The constant, aggressive pitching and rolling of the thermodynamic ocean swell violently ground the rigid, unyielding wooden peg directly into the soft, unhealed biological tissue of the stump, aggressively tearing open the fragile skin and mathematically guaranteeing massive, localized friction ulcers that constantly leaked highly infectious pus and dark red blood directly onto the rotting wooden deck. The iron hook was an equally terrifying, completely unsanitary nightmare. A heavy, rusted, deeply unergonomic metal claw that completely destroyed the pirate's biomechanical balance and frequently, aggressively ripped open the user's own flesh during the chaotic, completely uncoordinated kinetic violence of boarding combat, proving unequivocally that the true, blood-soaked history of the pirate Golden Age was not a romantic adventure, but an unyielding, mathematically doomed war against catastrophic nautical mechanics, horrific microbiological collapse, and the absolute biological decay of their own shattered bodies. completely and unequivocally eradicate the deeply patriotic, visually intoxicating cinematic hallucination of the glorious 18th century Royal Navy, the heavily sanitized Hollywood set piece where impeccably dressed, noble sailors cheerfully volunteer to serve the king, enthusiastically climbing the pristine rigging of a majestic ship of the line to defend the empire with honor and localized discipline. The modern entertainment complex absolutely demands that you visualize these maritime military vessels as highly organized, floating bastions of civilization and civilized warfare. When you aggressively strip away the soaring orchestral anthems, the crisp white uniforms, and the heavily filtered historical textbooks, the unvarnished, sociological, and biomechanical reality of serving in a national naval fleet reveals a terrifying, state-sponsored meat grinder of absolute biological enslavement, horrific psychological torture, and mathematically guaranteed physical deterioration. The men who manned these massive floating artillery platforms were absolutely not willing patriots. They were the desperate victims of the most terrifying, completely unregulated system of localized human trafficking in the history of the modern world. The legendary press gang. The directors completely sanitize or entirely omit the unyielding, sociopathic reality of naval recruitment. When a warship mathematically required more human biological capital to operate its heavy iron cannons, the captain did not simply put up recruiting posters. He deployed a heavily armed, utterly ruthless syndicate of hardened Marines directly into the suffocating, impoverished cobblestone alleys of port cities like London and Portsmouth. Operating completely outside the bounds of any recognizable legal framework, these heavily armed gangs executed terrifying, midnight kinetic raids on local taverns and boarding houses. They did not politely ask for volunteers. They utilized heavy iron belaying pins and solid oak cudgels to deliver catastrophic, localized, blunt force trauma to the skulls of completely innocent merchant sailors, dock workers, and tradesmen. The victims were violently knocked unconscious, physically dragged through the freezing mud, and thrown directly into the dark, completely unventilated bowels of the warship. When the traumatized, heavily concussed men finally regained consciousness, the ship was already 50 miles offshore in the unyielding Atlantic, and they were mathematically, legally transformed into absolute biological property of the state, condemned to years of completely inescapable, localized maritime slavery without a single trial or notification to their starving families, and to maintain absolute, unyielding control over 1,000 heavily traumatized, violently kidnapped men trapped inside a floating wooden cage, the naval officers absolutely did not rely on inspiring speeches or cinematic leadership. They relied entirely on a highly organized, mathematically calibrated system of horrific physical mutilation, epitomized by the most terrifying instrument of localized biological destruction in the naval arsenal, the Cat of Nine Tails. The silver screen relentlessly portrays naval flogging as a dramatic, relatively bloodless event where a stoic sailor takes a few lashes across the back before calmly returning to duty. The unvarnished, biomechanical reality of this punishment was an act of absolute, unyielding medical butchery. The cat was not a simple leather whip. It was specifically mathematically engineered for maximum dermal and muscular destruction. It consisted of 9 separate tails of heavy, tightly braided hemp rope, aggressively soaked in highly corrosive salt water and frequently tipped with solid, heavy lead weights or jagged fish hooks. When this massive, heavily weighted instrument was swung with full aerodynamic velocity by the ship's most muscular bosun, it absolutely did not simply sting the flesh. The heavy lead weights violently impacted the victim's back, transferring a localized, catastrophic kinetic shockwave that aggressively pulverized the subcutaneous fat layer. As the 9 tails were violently dragged back across the skin, they mathematically, aggressively flayed the dermal tissue completely off the human torso. Within the first 12 strikes, the victim's back was completely reduced to a biologically unrecognizable, heavily bleeding pulp of torn muscle fibers and exposed nerve endings. If a man was sentenced to 36 lashes, the unyielding mechanical leverage of the whip frequently and violently stripped the muscle tissue entirely away to expose the raw, white bone of the human spinal column and the fragile rib cage. The victim's central nervous system would violently crash from the absolute, unadulterated biomechanical agony, frequently inducing a state of permanent physiological shock. To prevent the man from mathematically bleeding to death on the wooden grating, the ship's surgeon did not apply a soothing, cinematic bandage. He aggressively ordered the completely raw, highly vascularized wound to be violently scrubbed with heavy, hypersalinated ocean water and concentrated vinegar. This barbaric, excruciatingly painful procedure was designed to aggressively cauterize the torn blood vessels, but it mathematically guaranteed a massive localized bacterial infection. The scarred, heavily mutilated men who miraculously survived this state-sponsored torture were permanently, biologically shattered, mathematically explaining exactly why these traumatized sailors so frequently violently mutinied and turned to the absolute anarchy of the pirate flag just to escape the unyielding, thermodynamic hellscape of lawful naval discipline. Furthermore, we must aggressively dismantle the heavily choreographed, visually spectacular cinematic hallucination of the great oceanic storm. The deeply entrenched Hollywood sequence where the heroic, square-jawed captain fearlessly wrestles the massive wooden ship's wheel in the absolute center of a raging, apocalyptic hurricane, miraculously steering the vessel through 100-foot waves while the crew cheers triumphantly. The modern algorithm relentlessly conditions you to view a wooden sailing ship as a highly buoyant, unsinkable fortress, capable of surfing massive oceanic swells. The true, unvarnished thermodynamic and hydrostatic reality of a deep-sea hurricane completely, violently shatters this suicidal delusion. An 18th-century wooden warship was absolutely not an impenetrable fortress. It was an incredibly fragile, highly rigid, localized architecture of seasoned oak and iron nails, mathematically fighting a completely unwinnable war against the ultimate, unyielding physical force on the planet. When a ship was caught in the localized barometric collapse of a genuine hurricane, there was absolutely no cinematic steering. The aerodynamic velocity of the wind routinely exceeded 150 miles per hour, generating an unyielding kinetic wall of physical pressure that instantly, violently snapped the massive, 3-foot-thick solid pine masts completely in half like dry twigs. The deafening, localized acoustic roar of the wind completely drowned out human screams, making all cinematic shouted orders a physical impossibility. But the absolute apex terror of the storm was the unyielding hydrostatic leverage of the waves. Water is mathematically incompressible and possesses immense, catastrophic kinetic mass. When a 50-foot rogue wave violently impacted the broadside of the wooden hull, it transferred hundreds of thousands of tons of localized kinetic energy directly into the ship's rigid internal skeleton. The heavy oak beams did not simply flex. Under this apocalyptic hydrostatic pressure, the massive iron bolts would violently shear completely in half, and the heavy wooden planks would aggressively, mathematically buckle inward. The ocean did not slowly leak into the ship. It violently exploded through the shattered hull in a localized, hyper-pressurized geyser of freezing, heavy salt water. The terrified men trapped in the pitch-black, suffocating lower decks were immediately subjected to absolute, catastrophic mechanical drowning. The massive, uncontrolled kinetic momentum of the ocean water violently threw heavy cannons, heavy wooden barrels, and screaming men completely across the dark, flooding hold, mathematically pulverizing the crew in a localized underwater meat grinder before the sheer, unyielding weight of the localized flooding dragged the entire shattered wooden carcass aggressively down into the crushing, lightless, thermodynamic abyss of the ocean floor. And if the algorithm dares to offer a cinematic glimmer of hope, it is through the deeply comforting, visually romanticized myth of the castaway, the heavily sanitized Hollywood sequence where a lone survivor washes ashore on a pristine, sun-drenched tropical island, quickly builds a charming bamboo hut, easily spears fresh fish, and lives a peaceful, philosophical life while waiting for rescue. The unvarnished, biological and ecological reality of being marooned on an uncharted, localized sandbar is a terrifying, slow-motion nightmare of absolute cellular collapse and unyielding psychological destruction. These remote islands were absolutely not tropical paradises. They were completely hostile, highly salinated, ecologically barren thermodynamic ovens completely devoid of localized freshwater aquifers. The exact moment the survivor dragged his battered, heavily traumatized body onto the abrasive, sun-baked sand, the biological clock of absolute, mathematically guaranteed dehydration began ticking. The human body is a highly complex, water-based thermodynamic machine. Without a massive, continuous localized intake of fresh water, the blazing, unyielding ultraviolet radiation of the tropical sun aggressively boils the internal moisture directly out of the cellular tissue. Within 48 hours, the victim's blood mathematically begins to thicken into a dark, heavy sludge, aggressively straining the cardiovascular system. The complete lack of localized saliva causes the tongue to violently swell and heavily crack, completely blocking the airway. Driven absolutely mad by the suffocating heat and the unyielding biological imperative for hydration, the desperate castaway would frequently, inevitably, turn to the ocean and consume the hypersalinated seawater. This was the ultimate, mathematically fatal biological error. The massive localized intake of heavy sodium instantly, aggressively triggered catastrophic, reverse cellular osmosis. The victim's own kidneys completely shut down, and the localized brain tissue violently dehydrated and shrank directly away from the human skull, triggering aggressive, terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations, massive kinetic seizures, and completely unacknowledged, screaming madness. The true, unvarnished history of the maritime castaway was absolutely not a heroic tale of localized survival and coconut radios. It was a brutal, terrifying, and mathematically guaranteed descent into absolute biological desiccation, leaving nothing but heavily bleached, anonymous bone fragments scattered across a nameless, unyielding sandbar as the absolute, final physical receipt for the unvarnished, blood-soaked reality of the age of sail. Completely and unequivocally obliterate the deeply ingrained, visually spectacular cinematic hallucination of the heroic naval boarding party. The heavily sanitized Hollywood set piece where brave Marines expertly fire single, highly accurate musket rounds from the rigging before gracefully descending to the enemy deck for a polite, highly organized sword fight. The modern entertainment complex has relentlessly conditioned you to view close-quarters maritime combat as a clean, tactical infantry engagement executed on a wooden platform. When you aggressively strip away the stunt choreography, the heroic orchestral swells, and the mathematical absurdity of aiming a completely unrifled, highly inaccurate smoothbore musket from a violently swaying mast completely enveloped in a blinding cloud of corrosive black powder smoke, the unvarnished, ballistic, and biomechanical reality of repelling boarders reveals a terrifying, localized kinetic meat grinder completely dominated by the absolute deadliest, most completely ignored weapon of the age of sail, the naval swivel gun. The directors absolutely refused to film the horrific, apocalyptic reality of this completely unregulated maritime shotgun. Mounted on the unyielding wooden rails of the ship's quarterdeck, the swivel gun was a massive, highly mobile, cast-iron cannon, essentially acting as a localized, point-blank weapon of absolute mass biological destruction. The desperate, hardened men operating these weapons absolutely did not load them with clean, aerodynamic, single, solid iron balls. They mathematically packed the heavy iron barrel to the absolute breaking point with a catastrophic payload of completely irregular, localized kinetic shrapnel, handfuls of rusted iron nails, jagged shards of broken green glass, heavy lead musket balls, and completely unsterilized, jagged pieces of scrap iron. When a densely packed boarding party of enemy sailors violently swarmed over the wooden rails, screaming and heavily armed with cutlasses, the defender did not engage in polite cinematic swordplay. He simply spun the heavy iron swivel gun directly into the absolute geometric center of the tightly clustered human mass and aggressively applied the slow match to the touch hole. The resulting thermodynamic detonation mathematically instantly transformed the heavy iron cylinder into a localized supersonic volcano. The hyper-pressurized black powder explosion violently expelled the completely jagged, unyielding payload in a massive, rapidly expanding kinetic cone of absolute biological erasure. This was not a localized, survivable gunshot wound. The apocalyptic wall of rusted iron and shattered glass aggressively, completely shredded the dense human cellular tissue, violently amputated multiple limbs simultaneously, and possessed the unyielding mechanical leverage to physically tear grown men entirely in half. The deafening, localized blast wave instantly cleared the wooden rails, leaving absolutely nothing but a horrifying, biologically unrecognizable, blood-soaked slurry of shattered bone and completely pulverized internal organs coating the main deck, mathematically proving that maritime boarding combat was not a theater of honor, but an unyielding, industrial slaughterhouse of catastrophic blunt force trauma. Furthermore, we must aggressively dismantle the deeply comforting, almost comedic cinematic illusion of the cheerful, highly musical maritime labor force. The silver screen relentlessly portrays the incredibly demanding physical operation of a heavy wooden sailing ship as a rhythmic, completely harmonious ballet, where ruggedly handsome men cheerfully sing perfectly synchronized sea shanties while effortlessly walking around the massive wooden capstan to gracefully raise the heavy iron anchor from the crystal-clear ocean floor. The unvarnished, biomechanical, and orthopedic reality of operating the massive, unyielding machinery of an 18th-century warship completely, violently shatters this childish, romanticized musical fantasy. The men bound to the massive wooden bars of the capstan were completely, absolutely subjected to an agonizing, localized gauntlet of complete thermodynamic and physiological exhaustion. An 18th-century heavy iron bower anchor mathematically weighed in excess of 3 solid tons, connected to the ship by a massive, incredibly heavy, waterlogged hemp cable that weighed thousands of pounds on its own. To physically break this massive, unyielding kinetic suction from the heavy, localized mud of the ocean floor, dozens of heavily malnourished, completely exhausted men were forced to push against the heavy oak bars of the capstan with absolute, mathematically maximum biomechanical leverage. The sheer, uncompromising physical tension placed upon the human skeletal structure during this completely unergonomic, agonizing maneuver was mathematically catastrophic. As the men desperately ground their bare, heavily calloused feet into the highly frictionless, completely soaked wooden deck, the unyielding mechanical resistance of the 3-ton iron anchor aggressively pulled back against their localized muscular structure. This absolute kinetic warfare did not result in a cheerful song. It mathematically guaranteed horrific, completely irreversible physiological destruction. The massive localized strain routinely caused the delicate, unyielding discs of the human lumbar spine to violently, aggressively rupture, instantly dropping the terrified sailor to the deck in a state of completely agonizing, permanent biomechanical paralysis. The extreme, unrelenting internal hydrostatic pressure mathematically required to physically push the heavy oak bars frequently and violently caused massive, catastrophic abdominal hernias, literally tearing the delicate internal muscular wall of the stomach and dropping the men into complete, unacknowledged biological agony. The true, unvarnished history of maritime labor was not a synchronized musical performance. It was a completely brutal, state-sponsored extraction of raw, localized human kinetic energy that aggressively, systematically shattered the human skeletal structure and left the men as completely broken, highly expendable biological components of a massive, unyielding wooden machine. And if we are to completely map the unyielding, terrifying reality of the age of sail, we must aggressively eradicate the visually intoxicating, deeply mysterious cinematic myth of the pristine, immortal sunken shipwreck. The modern algorithm relentlessly conditions you to visualize the dark ocean floor littered with beautiful, perfectly intact wooden galleons, their heavy oak masts still proudly standing in the deep ocean currents, complete with cinematic skeletons still rigidly gripping the wooden steering wheels, waiting for brave divers to claim their localized golden treasure. The actual, unvarnished, microbiological and ecological reality of the deep ocean completely, aggressively obliterates this highly theatrical underwater fantasy. The open ocean is absolutely not a sterile, perfectly preserved cinematic museum. It is a highly aggressive, completely unyielding biological meat grinder dominated by the ultimate, completely invisible apex predator of wooden maritime architecture, the Teredo navalis, historically known as the naval shipworm. The directors completely refuse to acknowledge the absolute, catastrophic biological appetite of this highly aggressive marine bivalve. The exact microsecond a wooden vessel violently sank beneath the unyielding waves, or even simply floated completely stationary in a warm, heavily salinated tropical harbor without highly toxic copper sheathing, the localized biological invasion immediately commenced. Millions of microscopic, completely invisible larvae aggressively attached themselves directly to the heavy, seasoned oak of the ship's hull. They did not simply rest on the surface. They immediately, violently began to bore directly into the dense cellular structure of the wood, utilizing highly abrasive, microscopic localized shells to physically, mechanically grind the oak into sawdust. Once entirely inside the completely dark, unventilated interior of the heavy wooden planks, these organisms aggressively, mathematically grew into massive, completely horrifying, worm-like creatures that could exceed 3 feet in length. They systematically, completely devoured the internal structural integrity of the ship from the inside out, mathematically transforming the heavy, impenetrable oak into a highly fragile, completely hollow, biological honeycomb. The massive, unyielding hydrostatic pressure of the deep ocean would then aggressively, violently crush this heavily compromised, localized wooden structure, completely pulverizing the majestic cinematic galleon into an unrecognizable, highly scattered debris field of rotting splinters and rusting iron cannons in a matter of a few short years. The absolute, unvarnished reality of the ocean floor is completely devoid of pristine pirate ships. It is an unyielding, thermodynamic, and microbiological void that actively, aggressively consumes and completely erases any localized human architecture that dares to penetrate its crushing depths. Finally, we must aggressively and completely dismantle the deeply comforting, highly sanitized cinematic illusion of the honorable pirate execution, the visually intoxicating Hollywood conclusion where the captured rogue delivers a final, charismatic, and highly defiant speech to a respectful crowd before engaging in a neat, highly theatrical hanging. The unvarnished, legal, and biomechanical reality of the British Admiralty's localized application of capital punishment reveals a terrifying, highly orchestrated, state-sponsored system of absolute sociological terror and mathematical biological humiliation. When a pirate was legally condemned by the localized maritime courts, they were absolutely not executed in a clean, cinematic town square. They were violently transported to execution dock on the highly contaminated, completely unhygienic banks of the River Thames, a completely suffocating, localized environment deliberately chosen to mathematically underscore the absolute, unyielding jurisdiction of the Admiralty over the maritime ecosystem. The execution was completely devoid of the mathematically precise, long drop, engineered to cleanly snap the human spinal cord. The condemned pirate was forcefully subjected to the horrific, slow-motion biological nightmare historically and colloquially known as the dance of the Hempen Jig. Utilizing a brutally short, completely unyielding piece of rough hemp rope, the executioner aggressively pulled the cart away from beneath the victim's feet, deliberately generating absolutely zero kinetic energy. The massive, abrasive rope violently crushed the trachea and aggressively compressed the carotid arteries, completely sealing the human airway. The localized survival instincts of the victim immediately triggered a terrifying, violent, thrashing panic in the empty air, their lungs frantically, agonizingly attempting to draw oxygen against the unyielding mechanical leverage of the noose. The completely conscious, biologically terrified victim slowly, violently strangled to death over a completely agonizing period of up to 20 minutes, directly in front of a heavily intoxicated, violently cheering, localized mob. But the absolute, undisputed horror of the maritime execution did not mathematically conclude with the cessation of the human heartbeat. The directors completely sanitized the terrifying sociological aftermath of the execution dock. The biological remains of the pirate were absolutely not respectfully cut down and buried in a localized cemetery. The unyielding absolute decree of the Admiralty mandated that the corpse be left aggressively hanging on the unyielding wooden scaffold completely over the river mud until 3 distinct, highly localized oceanic tides had completely washed over the rotting biological tissue. Once the body had been thoroughly, catastrophically submerged in the highly contaminated river water, the unvarnished nightmare escalated into a completely unrecorded, state-sponsored biological exhibition. The heavily decomposing, entirely bloated corpse was violently cut down and aggressively, completely submerged in a boiling, hyperheated cauldron of highly toxic, viscous black tar. This completely horrific, localized chemical application was mathematically designed to artificially preserve the biological tissue and heavily waterproof the rotting flesh against the highly corrosive oceanic elements. The completely blackened, biologically unrecognizable corpse was then forcefully, aggressively chained inside a massive, heavily forged iron cage, historically known as a gibbet. This completely terrifying, localized iron contraption was then aggressively hoisted high into the air at a highly visible, strategic geographic choke point along the River Thames. The tarred, heavily rotting biological remains of the pirate were left aggressively suspended in the open air for completely unyielding years on end. As the completely localized, highly corrosive oceanic winds violently swung the heavy iron cage back and forth, the decaying corpse acted as a terrifying, completely unvarnished sociological billboard. It was an absolute, unyielding, mathematically guaranteed message to every single merchant sailor and potential mutineer sailing down the river. The Empire did not simply execute its enemies. It completely, biologically erased them, aggressively denying them the fundamental human right of localized burial, and violently transforming their completely shattered biological tissue into a permanent, highly localized instrument of state-sponsored terror. This is the completely rusted, blood-soaked, and mathematically unyielding mechanical reality of the age of sail that the completely sterile, algorithm-driven modern world desperately attempts to sanitize and completely erase. It is a terrifying, highly localized history forged entirely in the panicked, deafening, and violently claustrophobic shadows of the gun deck, the agonizing, localized friction of the bone saw, and the completely unyielding thermodynamic void of the open ocean. But before we completely close the book on the absolute, unvarnished truth of the men who conquered this terrifying, localized maritime abyss, we must explicitly recognize the unbreakable, pioneer spirit that still runs through the absolute core of this nation. The raw, patriotic bloodline of the men and women who carved an entire civilization out of an unforgiving wilderness with nothing but raw grit, a heavy axe, and a piece of cold steel. We are actively mapping out the modern descendants of that incredible, undeniable strength today. So I need every single red-blooded patriot in this vanguard to pause this video right now, step up to the firing line, and drop your exact city and state down in the comments below, proving to the algorithm and the world exactly where the relentless, beating heart of this country still fiercely resides. Let us know which horrifying, unvarnished historical myth completely shattered your cinematic illusions the most. And never forget the absolute, mathematically guaranteed price that was violently paid in blood and rusted iron to build the modern world.